It's February 12th, 1976, and Frank Stagg has just passed away after spending 63 days on hunger strike at Wakefield Prison in West Yorkshire, England. His body was to be returned to Dublin and given a Republican funeral, beginning with a slow procession across Ireland to his hometown in the county of Mayo. This would take a few days and was something the Irish government wanted to avoid, believing his death was being politicised by the Republican movement. In this episode, we will learn about the lengths that the Irish government went to stop this, and how some members of Frank's family and the Republican movement responded. This is the Troubles Podcast, a podcast which explores the violence and bloodshed that occurred in Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and Great Britain, as multiple sides and organisations waged a bloody conflict over the status of Northern Ireland. Frank Stagg was the seventh child born to parents who would eventually go on to have 13 children. He was born in 1941 in the small village of Hollymount in the Irish county of Mayo. Frank's father, Henry, had taken part in the Irish War for Independence and then the subsequent Civil War, being a staunch supporter of Eamon de Valera, who was on the anti-treaty side. The treaty I'm referring to here is the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which was signed in 1921. The treaty gave Ireland a form of independence, in that Ireland was to become a self-governing dominion of the British Empire, similar to Canada or Australia. But they would still have to swear an oath of allegiance to the British Crown. Michael Collins was pro-treaty and believed that this treaty was a stepping stone towards total independence, whereas Eamon de Valera was on the anti-treaty side and wanted nothing but complete independence for Ireland. A civil war in Ireland then ensued as a result of this, which was won by the pro-treaty side, who received a substantial amount of arms and support from Britain, as it was in their interest for the pro-treaty side to be victorious. The treaty did end up proving to be a stepping stone towards Irish independence, and Ireland went on to officially become declared a republic in 1949. Ireland's historically dominant political parties are directly descended from this split. Eamon de Valera went on to found Fianna Fáil, and Michael Collins' legacy was claimed by Fine Gael, the other party. The time period I'm talking about in this episode is the early to mid-70s, when a Fine Gael government was in power in coalition with the Labour Party. Around this time period, many nationalists in Northern Ireland felt left behind by the Irish government, as they didn't perceive the Irish government doing much to prevent the British soldiers and loyalists from attacking them, so many of them initially turned to the IRA for support. In the Republic of Ireland, the Irish government adopted a firm stance against republicanism. They didn't want the Republic of Ireland to be a training ground for paramilitaries, or a place for them to hide after carrying out attacks in Northern Ireland and mainland Great Britain. And they absolutely didn't want to support or endorse these multi-day paramilitary funeral processions, especially while trying to maintain negotiations with the UK. That brings us back to Frank Stagg. Back home in the Stagg household, politics were quite important in the family, and there were plenty of long discussions and conversations. Frank's father would frequently get visits from his old friends in the IRA, who he had fought alongside with during the Civil War. The children would regularly sit down and listen to their father talk about Irish revolutionaries. Again, it's important to stress the difference between the old IRA and the IRA that was emerging at the start of the Troubles. Frank's sister Martha spoke about him in the T.G. Fork documentary Finney, of which much of this episode is based, saying that he was independent and when he had his mind set on something, he was resolute. Frank was quite a serious person who loved to sing, and he was very interested in politics. Frank went to school locally in Mayo, and at the age of 19 he moved to England in search of work. He first became a bus conductor, selling tickets on the bus, and then eventually a bus driver. In 1970 he married Bertie Armstrong, who was a Mayo native who also lived in London. With the outbreak of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, Frank joined a local branch of Sinn Féin in England, and shortly afterwards he joined the Provisional IRA. In 1973, he and 6 others were arrested, with the police alleging that he was part of an IRA cell who were planning bombing attacks in Coventry. 3 of the 7 individuals were found not guilty, but the remaining 4 were found guilty. Frank and English-born Catholic priest Father Patrick Fell were found to be the leaders of the unit. Frank was found guilty of conspiracy to commit arson and sentenced to serve 7 years in prison, though I've seen another source saying it was 10 years. He was sent to Parkhurst Prison on the Isle of Wight. It was considered one of the toughest prisons in the UK, and it was there that Frank met Michael Gone. Michael was a member of the IRA in London and had taken part in an IRA fundraising mission, attempting to rob a bank. Upon arriving in prison on the Isle of Wight, Michael requested political status. This is something that would come up frequently throughout the Troubles and would eventually lead to the 1981 hunger strikes. Republican and in some cases loyalist prisoners campaigned to be treated as political prisoners as opposed to regular prisoners, as they were only in prison as a result of their political beliefs. The British government refused to grant this status, so many prisoners went on hunger strike to have their demands met. It was at this time that sisters Dolores and Marion Price were in prison in England after being found guilty of the Old Bailey bombing, and were fighting to obtain political status and to be sent back to serve out their sentence in Northern Ireland. They began a hunger strike as a form of protest. To combat the hunger strikes, the sisters were force-fed. Force-feeding was quite controversial in the UK at this time. I've described it before, but here is how Marion Price described being force-fed. Quote, "4 male prison officers tie you into the chair so tightly with sheets you can't struggle. You clench your teeth to try and keep your mouth closed, but they push a metal spring device around your jaw and prise it open. They force a wooden clamp with a hole in the middle into your mouth. Then they insert a big rubber tube down that. They hold your head back. You can't move. They throw whatever they like into the food mixer, orange juice, soup, or cartons of cream if they want to beef up the calories. They take jugs of this gruel from the food mixer and pour it into a funnel attached to the tube. The force feeding takes 15 minutes, but it feels like forever. You're in control of nothing. You're terrified the food will go down the wrong way, and you won't be able to let them know because you can't speak or move. You're frightened you'll choke to death." To protest the treatment of the Price sisters, and to lobby for political status, Michael and Frank went on hunger strike, alongside a number of other prisoners, including Jerry Kelly, Paul Home, and Hugh Feeney. Michael was also subjected to force feeding while he was on hunger strike. His brother John described his condition after visiting him in prison. Quote, "His throat had been badly cut by force feeding, and his teeth loosened. His eyes were sunken, his cheeks hollow, and his mouth was gaping open. He weighed about 6 stone. Force feeding was quite risky, as there was always a chance that the feeding tube could go down into the wrong hole, into the lungs. The prisoners were also being fed against their will, so did everything in their power to prevent it being done to them. Michael was force-fed 17 times while on hunger strike. Then on June 3rd, 1974, he died after 64 days on hunger strike. His death has been shrouded in controversy to this day. The British government has stated that he died of pneumonia, whereas Michael's family stated that he died after prison doctors injured him fatally after pouring food into his lungs. Michael would become the first person to die on hunger strike during the Troubles, but he would not be the last. In the wake of his death, Michael's body was brought to Kilburn, an area northwest of London, where thousands of mourners lined the streets to pay their respects. Remember, London was a city full of Irish immigrants who travelled there in search of work. There was also an IRA honour guard walking alongside the coffin, composed of men with dark sunglasses, berets, wearing black polo necks and blazers. His body was then transported back to Dublin, where again it was met with a huge number of mourners and another IRA guard of honour. It lay in state in a church in the city centre before the procession slowly passed along the country, through towns and villages. All along the way there was a significant outpouring of support for him. Michael's brother explained that at virtually every town along the way, people had to come out and pay their respects. The Irish Minister for Justice at the time, Paddy Cooney, claimed that the procession was more sinister than it seemed, and that the IRA intimidated businesses in the towns that the funeral procession passed through, forcing them to close. Quote, "In all the towns, they had intimidated the local businesses into closing, and I regarded that this was an outrageous interference with the freedom of the people in those towns. who, if they did not want to close, they shouldn't have been intimidated into closing. And I and the government were determined that this exercise would not be repeated. The people of Ireland were divided. The old IRA from the War of Independence waged what was perceived a noble war, whereas the modern IRA, the provisionals, would always be judged more harshly for their actions, and as a result they would be met with varying degrees of support. The procession eventually arrived at Ballina in Mayo. Michael was then buried in the Republican plot in the graveyard there, with full paramilitary honours. This plot housed the bodies of men who had fought in the War of Independence as well as the Civil War. Prominent IRA member and one of the founders of the Provisional IRA, Daithí O'Connell, spoke at his grave, saying that Michael had, quote, been tortured in prison by the vampires of a discredited empire who were joined by decrepit politicians who were a disgrace to the name of Irish men. The second part of that quote was a direct jab at the Irish government. A burial such as this proved to be deeply embarrassing for the Irish government at the time, which was a coalition government between the political party Fine Gael and the Labour Party, under the leadership of Taoiseach Liam Cosgrave. They were considered anti-republican and didn't want Michael's funeral to become a rallying call for republicanism. As a result of Michael's death and the international attention that the Price sisters received, the British government stopped their policy of force-feeding hunger strikers and gave in to some of the demands of the prisoners. The Price sisters, Jerry Kelly and Hugh Feeney, were repatriated to Northern Ireland to serve out the remainder of their sentences. Frank's request for repatriation was denied, as he was an Irish citizen, not a Northern Irish citizen. He was moved to a different prison, Long Lartin, in Worcestershire, England. There Frank was asked to do prison work and wear the prison uniform, which is something that he and the Republican movement were deeply opposed to. Frank refused to do prison work and was sent to solitary confinement. As well as that, his wife and sisters were subjected to humiliating strip searches whenever they visited him. He then went on hunger strike again. This second hunger strike lasted 34 days, before the prison governor agreed to stop strip searching Frank and his family. In 1975, Frank was then transferred to Wakefield Prison in Yorkshire. Frank's brother described it as an old Victorian prison, cold, drafty, and like living in a cowshed. Here, he again refused to do prison work and was sent to solitary confinement. He then went on hunger strike for a third and final time. His demands were an end to solitary confinement, no prison work, and repatriation to a prison in Northern Ireland. His sister said of visiting him there, quote, I remember seeing sorrow in his eyes, because he knew we were very distressed, and then we felt so much sorrow for him, looking at his bone jutting out through his skin. It wasn't easy. Martha wrote Frank a letter, imploring him to end his strike, and talking about the life he could have after prison, but Frank continued on. Frank's mother also didn't agree with his strike, but she agreed to support him in his decision. On February 12, 1976, Frank Stagg died. He had spent 62 days on hunger strike. For context, Bobby Sands, who played a pivotal role in the 1981 hunger strike, died after 66 days. George, Frank's brother, was on his way to work when he heard Frank's death announced over the radio. In the immediate aftermath of his death, Republicans were furious at the Irish government for not doing enough to negotiate his release. The Irish Examiner reported that one day after he died, 10 explosive devices were detonated in Dublin, including the popular Shelbourne Hotel and Eason's bookstore. And in the month that followed, there were a number of bombs detonated in England. Frank had initially planned on being buried in the Stagg family plot, but 2 weeks before his death he changed his will, requesting to be buried in the Republican plot in Ballina instead, alongside Michael Gaughan. He may have done this for a number of reasons, one being to increase the pressure on the Irish government, who did not want another large Republican funeral, in the hope that they would intervene and cut a deal with the British authorities to repatriate him back to Ireland. So now we're split. Frank's wife, Birdie, wanted a private funeral with no Republican involvement, with him being buried in the family plot. This suited the Irish government's position, who wanted to avoid any paramilitary involvement and could use the wishes of Frank's wife as their reasoning. The Republican movement and other members of Frank's family, including his mother, wanted him buried in the Republican plot as per his wishes. The Irish government did not want to repeat what happened with Michael Gowan, with a multi-day procession across the country, and they were willing to go to significant lengths to prevent this. 1976 was a very violent year, and the tension in Northern Ireland was on a knife edge, and the government of Ireland did not want to allow anything that would be considered provocation, so they set a plan in motion. After Frank died, George travelled over to England to bring his body home. The plan was simple enough. Frank's body would be loaded onto an Irish cargo plane, as UK carriers refused to take his body, and George would then travel back to Dublin Airport with his body, where a crowd would be waiting. Frank's body was loaded on the plane, and then George got on. There were just 2 other men on the plane, and he sat down between them and they flew back to Ireland in silence. The plane touched down in Ireland, and as they were taxiing, George looked out the window and was confused. He asked one of the men, "What part of Dublin Airport is this?" The man replied, "Dublin. That's not Dublin." George, confused, then asked where they were. The men exchanged a look and then revealed themselves to be Garda Special Branch, and George was arrested. Unbeknownst to him and the crowd waiting in Dublin Airport, the Irish government had ordered the plane to divert and land in an airport on the west side of the country, Shannon Airport. George was brought to Ennis and then put into a cell. He was then questioned and asked if he had any involvement in, quote, any owl organisation, basically asking him if he had any connection to the Provisional IRA. After a few hours, he was released and went back to Shannon Airport so he could find out where his brother's body was. The coffin stayed in the mortuary in the airport overnight, and the Stagg family were told that the government were looking after the funeral arrangements. They weren't allowed to view the body. Garda presence was high at the airport. They set up a checkpoint, and everyone who entered had their names taken. Things got heated in the morning as Frank's body was removed from the airport via an Irish Army helicopter. Speaking on the TG4 documentary, George said of the moment, quote, "I walked over to the superintendent who was there, and I asked him, where are they taking my brother's coffin? I want to follow it. And he refused to answer. I said, we're his family and we're entitled to have his coffin, to have his body and to have his coffin. And he wouldn't make any reply. So at that stage, I put my finger in his face and I said to him, I'm telling you now, a day will come and I'll have him back, and I promise you that." Frank's body was brought to his family's local church in Robeen in Mayo, in anticipation of the funeral, which was to be the following day. There was a large Garda presence as well as armed members of the Irish Army present. There was a palpable tension in the air. Republicans were furious at the Irish government, calling them body snatchers, and even members of the public were angry at how this was being handled. This brings us to the first funeral of Frank Stagg, in his local church in Robeen, with 1,400 members of the Irish Defence Forces present and thousands of Republicans. Most of Frank's family did not attend this funeral, believing it to not be in line with his wishes. Bertie also appeared to have a change of heart, saying shortly before the funeral that she had given the Provisional Sinn Féin full authority to carry out her late husband's wishes and give him a full military funeral. His body was then brought, by police escort, to League Graveyard in Ballina, and Frank was buried around 50 metres away from the Republican plot. Despite the attempts from the Gardaí to prevent it, a volley of shots were fired over his grave as he was buried by 2 boys in their early teens. The following day, on Sunday, an event was organised by the Republican movement which would be considered Frank's second funeral. Thousands of people gathered at the cathedral in Ballina before walking to the graveyard. At Frank's grave, there were a number of speakers. Joe Cahill, who had been Chief of Staff of the IRA at one point, vowed that there would be another funeral for Frank, and he would one day be buried in the Republican plot. Frank's sister, Martha, stayed away that day, as she was afraid that she would appear on the news or in newspapers. Speaking of the day, she said, quote, "The perception was that if you were in Ballina, you were a part of the IRA. Martha did not want that association. She was a teacher and she was afraid that parents would complain if they saw her in the media. During this second funeral, a volley of shots were fired over his grave. Many people in the crowd thought that the gunshots were coming from the police, and there was chaos in the graveyard, with a number of scuffles breaking out and some members of the crowd throwing stones at the Irish soldiers, who responded by firing rubber bullets. Shortly after Frank was buried, Mrs. Ginty, who was in charge of the selling of the grave plots, got in touch with George. She was a Republican and let him know that the plot beside Frank's grave was vacant and recommended that he purchase the plot, saying, quote, "You never know what you'll want it for." George bought Frank's grave and the one beside it for £5. He placed a headstone over the vacant plot which read, quote, "Here in a grave dug by government agents lies the body of Vol Fruntius Stagg. His will required that he be buried in the Republican plot alongside his comrade in the IRA, Vol M. Gone. Having died on hunger strike in an English jail, his body was stolen and defiled by the pro-British government of the day. The truth for which he lived will blossom when his remains are reburied with the Republicans of Mayo, erected by his comrades and family." Just a side note that Fruntius is the Irish language form for the name Francis. Apologies for my pronunciation. The Garda remained cautious and maintained an armed 24-hour watch of the grave, which lasted for around 6 months. Eventually, this sentry was stood down after being deemed a waste of Garda time and resources. But to ensure no one attempted to dig up Frank's coffin, Minister for Justice Patrick Cooney ordered the grave to be filled in with 3 to 4 feet of concrete. This led to him receiving the nickname Concrete Cooney. 18 months after Frank died, George was contacted by Jerry Ginty, who was a local Republican and also the caretaker of the grave, and son of Mrs. Ginty, who told him that the Gardaí had filled in Frank's plot, but the plot beside Frank had not been filled in. He said that they could dig down into the adjacent plot, and as long as the concrete wasn't too far down, surrounding the coffin, they should be able to slide his coffin out. They began to make a plan to exhume Frank's coffin. It would need to be done in secret and by hand, so as to attract the least amount of attention. Jerry told George that they would need a total of 6 people to take part in this operation. Jerry and George made 2. Jerry had another friend, and then George went about finding 3 more men. That brings us to a wet night in November 1977, when 6 men approached Frank's grave under the cover of darkness. There was no moon on this night, which was perfect for the men, so they could work without the risk of being seen. George and the men he had chosen had stopped into the pub for a pint to calm the nerves, and as a result they were late, much to the annoyance of Jerry. The men were all assigned different tasks. 2 were on lookout duty, and then the remaining 4 took turns digging up the plot beside Frank's grave, with 2 digging at a time. The weather was so terrible that the men were soon soaked through to the skin, but this also helped them because it meant that fewer people would be outside. It was tough work, and whenever a car would pass by the graveyard, its headlights would sweep across the graves, and the men had to duck out of sight. Once they got down deep enough, they began to dig sideways to find Frank's coffin. Luckily, the cement had not gone down the sides of his grave, and they were able to affix ropes around the coffin and pull it out sideways into the hole they dug. They then carried the coffin the short distance over to the Republican plot and brought Frank to his final resting place, alongside the body of Michael Gone and other Republicans. The men then held a third and final funeral for Frank, saying a prayer, saluting, and then parting ways. George rang Frank's mother to tell her the news, and then someone tipped off the media, who reported on it the next day. Gardaí did launch an investigation, but there wasn't too much steam in it. In a way, they had accomplished their aim, though their actions had definitely led to a lot of publicity surrounding Frank. On the morning of the discovery, 3 plainclothed Gardaí knocked into the caretaker Jerry to ask him a few questions. Jerry pretended he knew nothing and said he had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. He walked with the Gardaí to the original grave where a number of people had gathered. One then walked over to Jerry, who was standing beside the three plainclothed Gardaí, and shook his hand, saying, "Congratulations, Jerry, you done a great job last night." Upon hearing this, the Gardaí started laughing. And though an official investigation was underway, eventually things were quietly winded down. So that's the end of the story of Frank Stagg. On one side, we had Republicans, those in the Provisional IRA, or those sympathetic to them who wanted to see Frank buried with his other Republicans. On the other side, there was the Irish government, who didn't want his death to turn into a Republican propaganda event. Then somewhere in the middle was the Irish public, who didn't know how to feel about the IRA and Republicans. The ritual of death is quite sacred in Ireland, from the wake the day before to the funeral on the day itself. The Irish government took control of that away from Frank's family. They diverted a plane, they prevented his family from seeing the body, and had an armed presence inside the church at his first funeral, eventually then filling his grave with concrete. It's understandable that some people would be outraged at this. So after 3 prisons, 3 hunger strikes, 3 funerals, and 2 burials, Frank Stagg now lies in the Republican plot in Ballina, in accordance with his wishes. That's it from me. Thanks, and see you next time.
If you are enjoying this podcast and want to support what I do, you can do so over at patreon.com/The Troubles Podcast. Patreons get early, ad-free episodes, and as well as that, I also release a companion video after each episode, talking about the episode itself, as well as any recent news related to Northern Ireland. You can also buy me a coffee over at buymeacoffee.com/Troubles Podcast. If you would like to support the podcast in other ways, you can also leave a review or simply tell your friends. It all helps. Thanks, and see you next time.